To start off with, before I introduce our panelists, I just want to remind us in terms of what DMARC is and the purpose of DMARC and why you're here. So DMARC, as you can see, stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. So basically acting as a check to make sure that only you as an organization is able to use your domain name and preventing any others that are not using the protocols that are involved with DMARC from using your domain name. So you're going to create a DMARC policy, and that's what we talked about in the webinar last week. And that policy is going to be what defines that messages being sent using this domain are being protected. And this way the receiving end knows what to do with those messages if any of those authentication mechanisms were to pass or fail. So it will, and this way you as the sender have that control rather than having the receiver worry about what to do with that particular message. Because most likely on their end, they're probably not going to figure it out and just say, okay, you know what, let's just let it go. So they need some level of help or guidance, and that's where the DMARC policy is going to help them make that determination. So overall, what DMARC is going to do is prevent those spammers and phishers from using your valid domain name. So this way they can't do things like email fraud, pass on malware, steal PII, and so on. Therefore, now improving your brand, it's going to increase the confidence and the trust in your brand. This way customers know it's coming from only your organization. Your partners and your business partners are going to know that it's coming from your organization. Therefore, building that level of integrity and level of trust in your brand. So it's great from a marketing perspective, especially. So now what we're going to do here in this with our panelists is going to basically give them each an opportunity to talk about DMARC and the implementation within their organization and talk about whatever challenges that they may have faced during that implementation. So those who are in attendance, please at any point in time, there is a questions box available to you. Please feel free to post those questions at any point in time. We're going to hold questions till the end, but go ahead and type it in there so that way we have those questions and that way you won't forget what those questions are. So let me go ahead and introduce each of our panelists here. So our first panelist is Tony Krzyzewski. He's worked in information systems for over 41 years, with the past 23 years specializing in cybersecurity. He's a member of the New Zealand Information Security Standard Advisory Group and is a national expert and voting member on the ISO 27000 Information Security Standards Committee. He's a contributor to development of CIS Controls version 7 due to release this year. And this year he has made a fellow of the New Zealand Institute of IT Professionals for his 40+ year contribution to the IT industry. And our next panelist is Frank Bultman. He's worked in information systems for over 20 years and has specialized in cybersecurity operations for the last 10 years. He has security experience in the finance, manufacturing, education, and healthcare verticals. He's currently a network security administrator for a healthcare system in the upstate New York region. He is primarily tasked with the evaluation, implementation, and monitoring of security controls on the hospital network. And our last presenter or panelist is going to be Chris Ellen. He's worked in information systems for over 15 years, with the past 10 years specializing in unified communication. He manages infrastructures for over 15,000 users across all UC platforms from email to AV systems. He regularly supports internal security efforts, specifically around PKI, which has helped push for TLS to be the default on all SMTP solutions. So these are our distinguished panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to start off the discussions. So our first panelist is going to be Tony. So Tony, you're unmuted, so please go ahead and start.
Hello. The processes involved with implementing DMARC vary somewhat based on the size of organization and complexity of email environment. The end goal, irrespective of size of organization, is to have an effective DMARC implementation which results in DMARC-capable mail receivers rejecting any emails that did not originate from your email systems. Getting to the point where you're comfortable with turning on the reject flag within your DMARC record takes some planning and may take some time to achieve if you have a complex email environment. The steps aren't complex, And unlike many changes to information systems, there's little or no risk to continuity of services due to the way that DMARC has been designed. We found the best way to start was to use the Global Cyber Alliance free implementation tool found at dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org. This tool showed us that our DNS SPF record was correct and showed us that we needed to implement DKIM as our next step. We run our own in-house mail system using a Kerio Connect mail server that has the ability to DKIM sign outgoing emails. We did, however, discover a small challenge when we tried to implement DKIM. Kerio has inbuilt DKIM key that's 2048 bits long. That's currently the maximum length supported. The challenge came when we tried to input that key into a text field within our external DNS service, which is provided by one of New Zealand's larger DNS service providers. No matter what we tried, the DNS management system would not let us enter the key as a text record. After some to and froing with their support team, it was determined that the reason we couldn't add our 2048-bit DKIM key was that their DNS system could only handle 256 characters within a text field. That was enough for a 1024-bit key, but not enough for a 2048-bit key. We now know that this DNS text field problem is not uncommon. So I advise you to check with your external DNS service provider as to whether there's a limit of 256 characters within text entries. If there is, either limit your DKIM key to 1024 characters or find another DNS service provider. The next step for us was actually generate our key. We found the port25.com website, and that could generate 1024-bit keys. So we generated one of these from the website, and with a bit of playing around within our Unix file system, we were able to replace the 2048-bit private key within Kerio Connect. Having generated the public key within Kerio, we created our DKIM text record within our external DNS and published our public DKIM key to the world. A quick check against the Global Cyber Alliance DMARC tool, and we had green ticks against SPF and DKIM. Almost there. Next up was creating the actual DMARC record for our DNS with a conservative pass setting. This meant that DMARC-capable receivers would report back on any emails being received, but wouldn't quarantine or block emails being received from hostile senders. Again, the Global Cyber Alliance site came to the fore, and the DMARC tool generated an appropriate DMARC record for us, which we pasted into our external DNS. A quick check back with GCA DMARC site showed that we're all go. Outbound mail from our office was DMARC enabled. But we also run our SAM for Compliance cloud service as an Azure web application. Built into the SAM for Compliance application is an SMTP service to issue task and action emails to users, as well as supporting the user authentication process. The SMTP handler within the application doesn't support DKIM signing, so we had a choice. Either rebuild our SMTP handler process to support DKIM, or look for an alternative solution that can handle both the Office email DKIM signing and the web application DKIM signing. What at first appeared to be a simple process for us had a little twist, which does emphasize the importance of fully understanding your email environment right at the start of the DMARC deployment process. If you can get to a point where all of your outbound email passes through a single SMTP server capable of DKIM signing your email, then your DMARC deployment is going to become much simpler. If you can't achieve that, then I suggest right from the start, look for an external service that is capable of DKIM signing all of your outbound email. With our combination of an in-house email system and the cloud-based SMTP system, we decided that this process was best handled in the cloud, and we found the answer in SendGrid. The SendGrid service has the ability to take over a DKIM signing on behalf of email domains, and we found this a very easy setup using their whitelisting process, with only a few DNS entries being required for each email domain being protected by DMARC. We now send email from the office and from the web application into SendGrid via an encrypted email session, and SendGrid does everything else for us. SendGrid appends our DKIM key, and the email goes out to the client, ready to be DMARC filtered by the recipient's email service. With DMARC filtering services such as Gmail and Outlook reporting back whenever they process an email from our domains, this is giving us the confidence that our DMARC deployment is correct, and immediately gave us confidence that our client emails relating to service delivery were actually being delivered. The DMARC reporting email volumes we were seeing initially were reasonably low and could be checked manually. As these have risen, we've now moved to the reporting for DMARC checking and reporting service on DMARC. This cloud-based service provides us with an easy-to-interpret information regarding how our emails are being handled by DMARC-capable receivers. We're now at the point where we're highly confident that changing our DMARC record to reject would not have any impact on our business activities, and we have achieved DMARC compliance to reject state in 90 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Next, we have Frank. Frank, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Shazad. So, protecting the credibility of our email domain name was the driving force which led us towards DMARC implementation. Healthcare organizations tend to see a high amount of fraud, and DMARC was a painless and effective tool to ensure proper handling of fraudulent email, which attempted to look as if it was legitimately coming from our hospital. Our goal was to have fraudulent email dropped on the receiving end, and to do this in a safe and methodical manner. So we slowly moved our DMARC policy in stages to include the reject flag. Once we were comfortable with spending a certain amount of time with the policy flag of none, and then migrating over to a policy flag of quarantine, we then moved over to a policy of reject. The steps to implement DMARC are not complex, and thankfully there are a number of online resources to assist in the process. GCA's online implementation tool greatly assisted us in this initiative and was the primary configuration resource that we used. Shortly before our DMARC implementation, we migrated our email from an on-premise Exchange server to Microsoft Office 365 service. During our Office 365 setup project, we ensured our SPF records were valid and correct. We confirmed that any third-party mail service we use for things like mailing lists and foundation emails had proper entries in the SPF record, so it specifically permitted them to send mail on our behalf. At that time, we also configured DKIM keys within Office 365. We confirmed configuration of SPF and DKIM with the GCA DMARC tool, which confirmed we were clear to move on to the next step, which was DMARC. So we generated an appropriate DMARC record, added it to our external DNS, and again, confirmed it with GCA's online tool. As I said, initially we configured it with a policy equals none, which means that it would provide us reporting on the messages that failed the lookups, but it would not take any action, so it was reporting only. After about 3 weeks of monitoring these messages, we were comfortable enough to change the DMARC record to a policy equals quarantine. And this would send the failing email to the recipient's junk mail folder. Several more weeks of monitoring this change, and we were comfortable with making our final policy adjustment to policy equals reject, which would instruct the receiving mail server to outright drop the message. Our implementation was now fully in place and successful. We continue to monitor the reports of fraudulent email that DMARC is dropping for us. And we're highly appreciative of the simplicity and effectiveness of the solution.
All right, thank you, Frank. And next, we have Chris Elland. Chris, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Shazad. Hi all. So currently, the company I work for, we operate in the engineering and construction space. The company operates a single primary SMTP domain across the whole company in multiple geographies. So unlike some other companies where they may run a .com, .co.uk, we run a single flat domain across all geographies. Due to recent and escalating phishing scams and a number of actual compromised email accounts due to some lapse user activity, this led us to start looking at further ways that we can protect ourselves in terms of attempts coming in to the company to spoof and our domain and essentially phish our users for these key credentials. We'd already looked and we had implemented SPF to lock down our own in-house send-in hygiene gateways. And we also included a number of solutions externally that were authorized to send as us. We then talked about within the team implementing DKIM as well. And it was at that point our security manager posed the idea to us to actually look at DMARC, which comprises both technologies and as that further policy level as well. So where did we start? Well, we started first with a review of our existing SPF record. To our kind of surprise, it was all good. We used a number of tools available free online that will do a number of things for you, from creating your first SPF record to actually validating syntax of your SPF record. And it's the latter that we found exceedingly useful. There are a lot of complexities, if you like, to the way that an SPF record can be constructed. And in our domain, we use anything from singular IP addresses to block subnets and further low-level include records as well. It was at this point we also started learning about some of the limitations of SPF. As Tony already alluded to, there are some potential issues you may run into with DKIM key sizes for DNS. And it wasn't until we started looking into all the other systems that need to send us and adding them to our SPF record that we started hitting those limitations, which for myself I previously found a surprise to find. And those include a 255 character limit per text record in DNS and an SPF lookup chain of just 10 lookups. What this means is that if you have a large number of solutions, external or internal, that are going to be sending as your domain, there's a limit to how much you can actually put in an SPF record and those nested records in order to authorize those. The reason why this is challenging for us is in our industry, we work with a lot of different collaboration platforms externally. These involve various different document management solutions, and as you can imagine, this could even be one per country. So very quickly, we are authorizing a multitude of platforms. However, obviously working through this in the free tools, we've got the syntax correct, and we moved on to looking at our DKIM implementation. Again, through our on-premise hygiene gateways, we have the ability to sign messages sent from our users. So we generated a key on the platform, published this in DNS, and we thought, great, we are signing, we are good to go. As per implementing DMARC, we then started with a standard sort of null policy so that we were just getting the reports back. What we found very quickly is that we were actually getting a good few hundred reports a day of various failures and systems that we weren't aware of as a company had been set up to send as us. And in our industry, what we found is this is quite a rife practice where anyone from HR, finance through to low-level project teams will have a service spun up used for a client to collaborate, and that service will start sending emails using the various clients' email addresses. This seems to be quite a common practice in those platforms, and what we found is there were quite a few that we didn't know of. So immediately, much the same as the others, we moved to an online tool. In our case, it was on Demark, to actually ingest the various reports that we were getting, and to actually visualize all of these failures that we were seeing, and to actually track down and identify all of the domains that were sending as us. This was very key for us because up until we did this, we thought that there were only a few systems, and very quickly we identified into double digits systems that were sending as us, and systems that were legitimately sending as us as well, that had been in place for a number of years. At this point, this is where that some of the various tools come into their own, and also this is where, for us, it was much more of an investigation process to find out what they are. So where we've had to go now is we've started a process of going through all of the different domains, finding out what the product is. These range from online Oracle, to various HR systems, to recruitment platforms. We found the company based across a number of regions. We used 3 different mass marketing systems: HubSpot, MailChimp, and Popolo, which used to be Newsweaver. So there's no consistency there. So we're trying to work with those. We've been working towards, and we've now got great buy-in for implementing DKIM for all of these systems. This has got over some of the SPF issues where you'll find some of these mass marketing companies have block subnet ranges which they need to put in your SPF record, and you'll very quickly find that you run out of space. So DKIM is definitely the savior of that piece. And as we move forward in the last 2 months, we have reduced our failure rate from over 50% down to just 25%. We're now just tackling those fringe cases. A number of these actually either involve using subdomains, which we can lock down due to limitations on our SPF or increasing lack of capacity, or just some systems that do not support DKIM as well, where we are isolating them into a subdomain so that we can secure our primary domain first and foremost. Again, we found that as we've implemented this across systems, we found that certain internal groups, HR and marketing specifically, have come back and said, you've improved our delivery rates. We always found that a good 25–30% we always never got delivered, and these are now improving those rates as well. We've also noticed internally that we've started reducing the amount of fringe spam and fringe spoofing as well coming in, so we are much more identifiable. We are working towards and hopefully in the coming month working towards actually moving to a quarantine policy for Demark once we've isolated the last few systems, and then hopefully progressing forward to reject once we are confident with that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all panelists. So at this point, I am going to actually unmute all the panelists, and then I'm going to open up the floor to questions from our attendees. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to post those questions in the questionnaire box that you have, or the questions box that you have, and you go to go to webinar control panel. And we will post those questions and pose them to our panelists. And there is one comment that we do have here is that Mandrill does not support nested SPF records. Their entry must be in the first record, which causes an issue managing our SPF. And that is actually the case. We've seen Mandrill caused issues for quite a few folks. So you're not the only one. So the recommendation is go ahead and try adding them in, or at least try to go to a level up if you can. So for example, if you're using MailChimp, and I know MailChimp uses Mandrill app for some other things. So if you just put in MailChimp's entries, that should include the Mandrill SPF as well within their records. So that way it should hopefully prevent those that 10 domain lookup and reduce those issues. But at GCA, we are trying to get in contact with some of the Mandrill folks to see if we can do anything to help alleviate this issue. And we're working with some of the DMARC vendors as well to try to get them to add some pressure to Mandrill. So one question we have here, and I know all the panelists have mentioned it to some point, but just to reiterate, if you could. So what concerns, if any, did you have about DMARC initially? So before you actually went into the implementation and dove into it, what are some of the concerns that you have? So we'll pose this to Frank first.
Sure. So initially, the concern was that it would take a lot of internal resources to implement and to monitor DMARC, and it would basically take a lot of time away from other projects. We are not a large organization, so there are limited resources in order to work on some projects, and that turned out to not be the case. Thankfully, it was not a heavy lift. It was the process we were able to do in stages. Minimal risk, as I had mentioned, with having the policy set as none initially and just sort of in a monitoring phase, and it allowed us to get to a comfort level to take it to the next step. So thankfully, not a lot of internal resources in our implementation were needed, and overall, a lot of value for what we were able to get in the end. Another concern was that it was going to reject legitimate mail, and again, I'll point back to the policy. We were able to stay at a policy of none long enough to get a comfort level that everything was working fine with it, and then we moved over to the policy of quarantine. And then lastly, the other initial concern that we had was that it would not be compatible with with our systems. And thankfully, we didn't really run into any roadblocks when in talking to our DNS provider, in talking to our Office 365 implementation folks. We really didn't hit any roadblocks, and knock on wood, I mean, it was a pretty smooth transition from beginning to end. And thankfully, we were able to, end up with a reject policy.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
For me, the DMARC implementation in terms of the DMARC policy, there wasn't really any fear or hesitation around that for effectively putting in your starter policy of none so that you're effectively in a monitoring mode. Actually, for me, it was more a piece around the implementation of the prior to combining technologies of SPF and DKIM, in terms of getting that right so that when a system is actually sending out the signing, the correct information is in DNS and available. We've actually found on a couple of times that there's a few transient errors because the DNS lookup has failed. The provider doesn't return the address quick enough because the record's quite large. Or on the SPF side, if you move from a soft fail to a hard fail, the ability to just start having email delivery issues. So there was a certain degree of caution of whether or not DMARC was implementing DMARC was also going to require us to move to a hard fail policy on SPF straight away, and certain things with DKIM. So it was somewhat of a relief as we started getting into it that we can stick with a soft fail, and actually the DMARC policy works around the idea that a soft fail or a hard fail is still a fail. So from an SPF level, we're not actually causing ourselves more harm, and actually that was moving forward. But there was a little bit, it was a little bit of information digging to actually satisfy everyone that moving forward with any of the three pieces from SPF, DKIM, and DMARC was not going to affect delivery for any system. And then the latter piece, as I mentioned in my bit, was the number of systems that we started finding in the first reports. It added a little concern that, well, how many systems might we affect if we get one bit wrong here? But thankfully, you know, the process has been very straightforward. You are in full control of it. So from a monitoring phase, it's great because you get a full visibility without affecting anything. And that helped quell a lot of people's issues.
Okay, so I mean, this kind of goes on to another question that, you know, to someone's posting is that, so was it easier to implement DMARC at policy level none, or is it easier to implement SPF and DKIM? So in essence, which one was the easiest to do? And for DMARC at policy level none, instead of talking about quarantine and reject. So Chris, I think you partially answered that question, but go ahead. I mean, just go ahead, just state it again.
For me, the DMARC none was the easiest piece. Partly having worked with SPF before and known a bit about the syntax, actually using an online tool to create your first DMARC policy none record with the aggregated reports and the failure reports addresses in. It's very quick, it's very easy, and once you've published it, all you're going to do is just start getting emails back. It's very quick and easy. As you know, we've all across the panel kind of said, the SPF piece, there's actually, it can actually be a lot more to it depending on how many systems you need to put in your SPF records. And DKIM as well, you suddenly run across weird little DNS pieces. We had it as well, and you have to format the record in a certain way to allow it to still be resolvable, and actually, yeah, the DMARC record on its own, that single record was the easiest piece.
Tony, would you like to add?
Yep. Yeah, the I think of the whole thing, I think it was SPF was the biggest challenge. And I'd just like to add, for those people who got hitting this limit of 10 in the SPF records, the company on DMARC does have a dynamic SPF solution, which allows you to go beyond the current limits without having to use SPF flattening. So it's a good way around this problem if you've got a lot of senders, basically. But really, I think the whole thing about DMARC is it is a step-by-step process. Nothing really is there that's going to be damaging. Get the DNS records right, get the DKIM set up, and then adding the DMARC on the end is actually the simplest bit of all. You know, if you've got DKIM in place, you've got SPF in place, flicking the DMARC on is just the last icing on the cake, which brings it all together into a very viable environment. Yeah,
yeah, I would agree. DMARC was probably the easiest part of our implementation. With everything else in place, it was just a quick DNS record change to step through the different levels of policy that we wanted DMARC to enforce. Again, with our setup, our SPF and DKIM setup was relatively easy, but the final piece, the DMARC piece with everything else in place, was really quite simple.
Thank you. So there's a question here that's posed as, how do we address emails from listservs? I'm not sure if anyone will be able to answer that question. If not, then I can take that. Does anyone want to take a shot?
well, you'll share that.
So when it comes to listservs, and it's actually, this is a very good question because DMARC actually SPF, DKIM, and DMARC don't play very well when it comes to mailing lists and intermediary systems like listservs. So what will happen in those kinds of situations when you're receiving messages from a listserv, there's a chance that DMARC could end up rejecting it depending how that listserv is set up or how the originating sender has their policy set up. What needs to be done on those listservs is there's a new technology called ARC. It's Authenticated Receive Chain. This is going to be another technology that actually encapsulates and protects and preserves SPF, DKIM, and DMARC capability. So that way it doesn't make an alteration, it does another level of encapsulation. So what those listservs need to do and those mailing list providers need to do is incorporate ARC onto their systems. There is more information. The site is called arc-spec.org. If you look that up, that's where you can get more information. There are people there that can help you with the implementation of ARC as well. If you're having trouble with that, just feel free to contact us here at GCA and we can make the connections for you with some of the people that have been working on ARC, and they can help you with the implementation process. So there's a couple more questions here. What were some of the hurdles that prevented you or may have prevented you from moving up to the next enforcement levels of either quarantine or reject? Frank.
Sure. So, initially there was some internal concern over legitimate messages being dropped or sent to quarantine. And quite simply, when we initially put in our policy of none, we were able to show our internal management the reports of the stuff that was spoofing our domain, that was going out to external email, and that made the decision pretty simple to take the next step. So that alleviated that concern. And secondly, I would say that some folks would say, so what is this going to do for us? It seems that it may be helping more of the recipient out than the internal receiving mail. And our discussion around that was that it was helping to protect the integrity of our domain. And we went over a few cases of how phishers would potentially use our domain to try and commit acts of fraud. So basically, we just built a business case around how it protects our brand, and that it actually it's for the greater good of the overall email systems. But initially, the concern was, our messages that we send, a legitimate message that we send, are potentially going to get, sent to quarantine or dropped. And there was, quite a bit of concern with that because of, us being a healthcare organization.
So this is one thing that a lot of folks have already mentioned. All three of the panelists have mentioned is about reporting. So I believe, I think Chris and Tony had mentioned that they use a third-party provider. Frank, I'm not sure if you have decided to use one or not. But was it better to use that third-party provider, or were you able to do some level of analysis on your own using like like another tool that you may have used or something that you may have used internally? Go ahead, Tony.
Initially, the one thing that you need to realize is when the records come back, they are actually in an XML format. Just simply reading through the XML initially, yes, the first few, it's easy, but it gets pretty boring after a while. So using an online tool to decode the XML does help. But once the volumes get up, and especially in a larger organization, those volumes are going to rise pretty rapidly. So moving to a tool that basically gathers that information together and gives you useful reports is going to be essential. If you're a very small organization, certainly just using the quick XML decoders that are available online is easy. But anyone with any volume, you really do need to start looking at an online service or application to decode for you, my opinion.
Chris?
I totally agree. We found very quickly after we deployed our DMARC record, the following day, we'd created the 2 mailboxes for the forensic reports and the aggregate reports, and the following day I was already into thousands. And the reason that we'd done it initially, pointed it to our internal systems, is, much like everyone else probably wants to, I had a curiosity. I wanted to see what that report looked like, and as Tony said, it's XML format. It's fairly easy to read, and you can put it into an online parser to get a bit more of a forensic analysis to give you an idea of what that report actually contains. And that's where we first started finding that the first report came because of a system that we didn't know about. And just looking through the emails, I very quickly found there were more. And the volume of email, it just was not practical to sift through. So one of the things we actually took the initiative to do is a lot of the companies online that do these, DeMarc, Nagari, on DMARC, they all generally offer something like a 30-day plus trial. And even if you can't get all of the really detailed reporting out of it day one, or you only get to use it for one domain, if you've only got one domain, that's great. It's great for high volume email companies to actually just get some visibility. It's that piece which is a bit like a try-by, but by getting that visibility, you can immediately see how big a problem you have. You might find that everything is green and you've only got a small 5% issue, which means that you've not got a lot of work to do. Or in our case, you might start with a lot of red and realize that it's a much bigger task than you thought. So, I'm an advocate of these, of the consolidated platforms.
All right, thank you. Frank, do you have anything to add to that?
We handle internally. Thankfully, our volume is not high enough where we've had to look to a third-party product. We've been in reject mode for quite some time now. So we're pretty comfortable with the configuration, and we monitor, we check, but thankfully our levels are not so high where we need third party. So we just use like an online XML parser to kind of make it easier to look at the reports.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're getting to the closing minutes of this panel. So what I'd like to allow, if there's any final thoughts that any of the panelists do have that they would like to say, then they get a chance to say before. If you have something, please say something. If not, then it's not no problems. So we'll go in reverse order than when we started in the panels. So Chris, are there any last thoughts that you would like to add?
Sure. So I'll actually follow up on a comment from one of the other panelists, which is when you're trying to sell this back to, if you have to sell this back to the business, it really needs to be viewed as a way to protect your brand. It will help protect your users if your own systems can support the DMARC implementation in terms of email coming back to you. If you use a lot of cloud services that send as you will want to open up for those, but not the malicious ones. We've already found internally that we're blocking more traffic back to our users, which is malicious. But it is about brand protection as well. And we have experienced one or two incidents where a client has temporarily blocked us due to not malicious behavior, but unexpected out of the norm behavior, either setting up new mail gateways or just an influx of email in the wrong way. And these technologies help actually protect you from various incidents like that.
Shazad, I'd like to add that I really appreciate the work that you and your team at GCA are doing. I think that this is a really important initiative. I think that Tony and I were discussing this earlier, and we agree that this really should be mandatory for certain industry verticals. Healthcare, government. There's a lot of value in a proper implementation of DMARC, and as everybody knows, email needs some work in order to it's not a secure platform, and these types of initiatives go a long way towards pushing it towards a more secure platform, I would say. So thank you to you.
Thank you for that, and I do agree with about the government, and the UK government I know did that mandate, and they're being very successful. I know in the US they released BOD 1801, and they actually did very well in their 90 days. They still have a ways to go. I think the number that Agari shared with everybody was about 63% of the federal government agencies had implemented a DMARC at one of the levels, which is great, and that's within 3 months, because initially when they started they were at, I believe, 10%. At the start. So that's a big movement, and I do agree about the other sectors as well. Tony.
Well, I've been involved with SMTP services since the very beginning of commercial internet, and SMTP has some fundamental flaws in it, and DMARC is a major means of resolving these flaws. There's really no excuse for not putting DMARC in my opinion. It's easy. It's something that you just simply do. As we say, it's a total no-brainer. It's easy to put in place. Go with it.
Right, thank you. So just some next steps here, just so people know. So the next GCA webinar is about reporting and analysis. That's going to be February 6th and also February 14th. Both of them will be at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please go ahead and register for that if you haven't already. The link that you see below will get you to the registration site. That link will actually also get you to what the panelists had mentioned about the Demark vendors. So some of our Demark partners, about 6 or 7 of them, were willing to provide a 90-day free trial period during our 90-day challenge. So go ahead, check them out, see what they're making available, and give them a try for reporting capabilities. And then we also did record this as well as our past webinars. So if you go to either to that same site, the GCAGlobalCyberAlliance.org/DMARC in 90, or you can go to our YouTube channel and subscribe there. We have various DMARC videos as well as other videos from some of the other products that we have that are out there. So again, I would like to really thank everyone for joining us. I really thank you very much to all of our panelists that are giving their time to go through what their implementation with DMARC and the support of DMARC. If at any point in time folks have questions, please feel free to email at either one of these addresses. If you do have specific questions for any of the panelists, again, you can feel free to email me and I'll put you into contact with those panelists. Otherwise, again, thank you very much, and thank you again to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.